today's guest is Stu McGill, a retired professor at Waterloo University in Canada. He was a friend of Bernie Clark's. You might remember, listeners, watchers, Bernie and I spoke recently, and Stu has collaborated with Bernie, or at least is a good friend, on the particular issue of back pain and back health, which we're going to talk about today. Stu's written an excellent book called Back Mechanic. It's an excellent book. I've read it a couple of times now. And if you're anything like me, as a yoga practitioner, you may have thought that your back problem was just a problem you had to put up with. Well, here is Stu to say that maybe you don't have to just suck it up and put up with it. So before I waffle on, I want to get on track today. And I'm going to open with one of my favorite quotes that I think I put in a post recently of Stu's. I believe it's yours. And when you say, genetics loads the gun, exposure pulls the trigger, and the social milieu, it's a kind of posh word, so social context, I suppose, influences the response. So I wonder, Stu, if you could just expand on that a little bit, just to get us rolling today.
Right. Well, to give credit, that wasn't my expression. No, a good friend of mine named Bill Maris, who is a professor of spine biomechanics at Ohio State University, said that, and I stole it. But I'll credit it back to
very good. Yeah.
Well, in the broadest context, everyone has a specific back pain story. So that's why we emphasize a thorough assessment of each individual to understand their specific pain mechanism and pathway, and that informs us of how we're going to desensitize their pain, retune their body to move without that pain trigger, and then build variables to add performance to it. So that's the individual side of things. But people want, well, I'm asked all the time, back pain, as if it's this generic thing that's common to everybody. And my point is, it is not. But let's start with the common, and that expression, genetics loads the gun. No one is average. What you get from your parents and your genes are your specific anatomy. Your spine has features like the angle of the facet joints. I have facet joints that are orientated this way. I can flex and extend without any stress at all. But if I was to play golf and twist, my facet joints bind up right away, and I'm not a good twister. That creates stress for me. But someone who was given from their parents open facet joints, they can twist away with no stress. But when they go into extension, the upper facet collides with the lower, bends the bone, and those are the ones that end up with spondylolisthesis, or a fracture of the pars bone. So what gives you a great advantage in one, if we were to put this in our yoga framework, in one pose, would cause you to have more stress in another. That's why if you look at who gets stress fractures in that bone that I was just describing, gymnasts, dancers. But in order to be a gymnast, you have to be able to twist, and therefore you found gymnastics with your open facet joints. But as they repeatedly extend, land, flex and extend and whatnot, the stress strain reversals cause that bone to crack. So what gave them the advantage to be a great gymnast also helped with that predisposition to the injury. So that's the genetic side. The other thing is people, no one is average, and we all form a spectrum. There are phenotypes of collagen, for example. One person can repeatedly flex their spine and pick up something, and they will get an end plate fracture, which is a fracture of the end plate, and the disc flattens a little bit. The next person gets a disc bulge posteriorly. It's governed by the phenotype that came from their parents and the constituent resilience that they have. So even common lifting instructions need to be customized a little bit to the person. The second part of that, exposure pulls the trigger. If you have a spine from your parents, you still need exposure to something. It's like smoking. Um, some people have a natural resilience against cancer, but you still needed to smoke the cigarette. So the exposure is load. Load has a magnitude. How much load is placed on that particular aspect of the spine? How often is it repeated? Because if I took a credit card and I prepared this and you bend it back and forth, eventually that credit card will break. But that's the number of repetitions, again, came from your parents that will eventually lead to that stress crack. The length of time that a load is applied to a body. So a long static posture, tissues are viscoelastic. They creep and they break as a function of deformation, not load, the deformation that comes from the prolonged load. But the mitigator of all of this is rest. So we have load in its various forms that stresses the tissues, which is good as long as it's underneath the tipping point. But then you must have a rest period to allow the body to adapt from the stimulus. So do you see the failure in exposure? It may not be that someone is overloading themselves, it's just they never rest. Or the next person rests so much that they never get enough stimulus to create a change. So this is a real dance. The final part, the psychosocial. We have patients here who they are type A. You recognize the pattern as soon as they come in, and you know when they say, I have to go to the gym every day and ride on the treadmill for 45 minutes. Otherwise, I'm going to murder my husband. It's my stress reliever. And do you think if I say do 10 repetitions, they're going to do 10? No, they're going to go back to the elliptical and they will cause their pain. And until we break through to them and say, good, go have surgery. And they'll say, what? And I'll say, or let's pretend you had surgery. Tomorrow, if you had surgery, you will not go to the elliptical and pick the scab and come back to me next week with the same pain. You are going to rest. You're going to get up a couple of times to go for a pee. The next day, you're going to go for shorter little walks. And the next day, we'll start adding some bird dogs or some asanas or whatever. Point being, that's the first. So surgery will work for them because it's forced rest. Now, the next psychological profile that comes in will be a type B. They're movement adverse. They don't like to do things with their bodies. I'll say, do 10 reps of this exercise, and they bargain with me why they only need to do 3, or they will skip today. So do you see, their psychology determined the adaptation for robustness that they needed, and I have to manipulate. The social context is very interesting as well. You will have a person, and I'll say, well, you need to walk every time you eat, and even before you go to bed. That will address your specific pain mechanism. And they say, Professor, I can't go out and walk at night. My neighborhood isn't safe. So do you see, if I can't deal with that, they're guaranteed to fail. That explains the equation of genetics, exposure, and the psychosocial.
The psychosocial, I was going to say the wider exposure as well, which maybe I think you touched upon somewhere else, as much as perhaps they're an athlete or, a yoga practitioner belonging to a certain group of yoga practitioners, like we are in Ashtanga yoga, and there's a certain context around pain and injury there, right? So that general kind of, let's say, narrative that's in the community around how you deal with things also, influences surely the athleticism of, say you're a weightlifter or something, and there's a granular group around you, and they're also suggesting a certain way to deal with things, so I'm sure that.
Well, yes, the physical culture around a movement philosophy, we could say yoga, or we could take CrossFit, or something else. Let's take, I don't know exactly what you do because I haven't worked with you. Okay, so you've given me a name to describe your yogic philosophy, but I know Bernie Clark, and some yoga groups who've asked me to come in and speak and whatnot I go in there and it's a sport. They are forcing each other to compete, I'm
That's
just
kind of
looking at
like
them.
the yoga I'm talking about. Yeah,
Yeah,
I
and,
mean,
and
I don't teach it like a sport, but it can become rather
it
like that. Yeah,
becomes a
yeah,
sport.
yeah.
It is so polluted. And, they're there with impinged hips and disc bulges and, wonky shoulders. And now they're still stretching into their
Yeah,
pain and
you've
pushing
just
one another.
defined the yoga context that of
Right.
Ashtanga quite well.
Versus a very cerebral scientific approach. And, when you go to Bernie's class, he will perform an assessment on everybody and say, those people who can't do this, you go to that half of the room. You people who can, you go to this half of the room. And here's how we're going to break it up to make sure we stay below the tipping point and we're stimulating positive adaptation and not
Yeah,
a pain mechanism.
I suppose I'm trying to bring a bit more of Bernie's philosophy into the arena of the yoga that I do, which is Ashtanga yoga. It is a more gymnastic, a more like basically like what you described, really, kind of pushing and even if they're in pain, it's hard to stop. Often students pushing themselves with even when they've told you they've got a serious prognosis. So yeah, that's why we got you on. Basically, I was gonna also ask you, and the genetics loads the gun. So we're assuming that certain people with certain athletic propensities are not there by mistake or by coincidence, probably because of the certain shape of the facet joints, or is there any other? I mean, you mentioned that as one specific idea, but what about other back muscles? Is there any pattern that you could kind of other supportive back muscles that might lead to people being particularly applicable to one discipline, physical discipline, or another?
Every single variable in your body is on a spectrum and will give you a certain advantage or disadvantage. What comes to mind as I was listening to that was there's this photographer in New York, and he photographed the Olympic podium for different sports. And you would see the discus throwers. All three were the same body type. They look the same because they are elastic strength athletes. The shot putters look slightly different. The hammer throwers look slightly different. But then take the swimmers who are pulling water, and the musculature, the length of their body versus the length of their legs, all very, very different. The wrestlers are different from anyway, you get what I mean. That's outwardly very specific to a particular, having the advantage to compete at a sport at a high level. You have to have the advantage. But when we look at constituent tissues, so we take the disc, for example, the hip is a ball and socket joint. It is made to produce power, tremendous joint torque through a full range of motion. That's what the ball and socket is made to do. Some people mistake the disc and the spine as a bunch of ball and sockets, and they treat it that way, and then they get into trouble. So power is force times velocity. So I will say a truism to reduce your general risk of back injury is keep spine power low, keep hip power high. What do I mean by that? So power is force times velocity. Imagine a golfer, lots of motion and velocity in the spine. But when you measure elite golfers, even ones who hit a long way, they're not activating the muscles to 100%. It is a tuned storage of elastic energy, and then they uncork that elastic energy very strategically just before they impact the ball. The hips slow down, uncork the energy out of the spine, and then even the shaft of the club has stored energy, and it kicks just before it hits the ball, and all this is timed, etc. Getting back to the variance in collagen, these are collagen strands. It's not a ball and socket joint. My shirt is a fabric made up of strands. If I wanted to damage my shirt, I would create stress strain reversals back and forth like this, and the fibers would slowly delaminate, not necessarily tear, but delaminate. Well, if my shirt was holding a liquid like the disc annulus is holding a gel nucleus inside. That gel, being a liquid, is trying to find the delaminations and then work its way through the delaminations. That's what a disc bulge is. So you see, it's motion that causes the delamination, and then it's load that causes the pressurization of the nucleus to squirt out. So the ability of this fabric to not delaminate is governed by a phenotype. Some people have great resilience to it and others don't. So that's why some
The
people...
phenotype, sorry, I don't recognize that terminology.
A phenotype is the behavior of that forms a spectrum, and that behavior is governed by the genes and a little bit of adaptation. And I don't want to get into gene expression. That's a whole nother discussion. But my point is, people have predispositions to resilience, but also to the opposite. They succumb fairly quickly and they get disc bulges by repeatedly flexing the spine over and over again. So you can see that red line in the back of the disc there. And now I'm going to bend forward and squeeze the spine. Do you see the delamination occurring and the gel coming out right at that red line? Now that gel, if it hits a nerve, like I'm showing now, that quite often is a cause of people's back pain. But now let's go back to the exposure. That is the most common pathway for a disc bulge to occur. When I look at the very special population of yoga practitioners, if they focus on mobility, but not load in their body, so they are typically a thinner type of body, not a tremendous amount of muscle. They're not under big bars squatting heavy load or anything like that. They work on mobility. Interestingly enough, it is more rare to see that kind of a disc bulge. They have very plump discs because they don't load their spines typically the way they would in a CrossFit gym, as an example. So when they squeeze the spine, the disc squeezes down, and then when they bend forward, the collagen posteriorly draws in a little bit. So they get relief from bending forward, and it's not uncommon to see an anterior disc bulge. So isn't that interesting that the practice of yoga will attract a certain type of body type that enjoys that type of exposure? And it's not the phenotype that will do really well in a powerlifting gym pulling 300 kilo off the floor. Do you follow the logic in all of this?
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's why I've gotten in trouble before from people who haven't listened to this explanation. And I'll say deadlifts and yoga don't really go together. Choose one. And but don't mix
Yeah,
them up.
I suppose. I mean, so going on to the exposure, then more specifically, would you? I mean, with your limited knowledge of yoga, not as a practitioner, I assume, but having seen yoga clients, how would you say that you might govern the exposure most, with most generally speaking? Would you combine it with other things like lifting, or would you recommend a person just does yoga? And I mean, and to that end, you talk about the spine and stiffness a lot, but in yoga, people are bending the spine a lot, especially, I mean, you've seen the wheel or the bridge, the back bend, right? I mean, maybe you wouldn't recommend that kind of thing at all as a spine doctor. So yeah,
Well,
anything. I mean, people are going to be wanting to listen. How can this guy help my back pain? Because so many people in yoga have back pain, and often from folding forward. You mentioned the folding forward they like, but often, as much as back bending, it is actually often caused by folding forward. I hear just as much almost. Yeah.
that's true. We track it. That's true. How we start on this, Adam, is I have no opinion on that until it's informed by a thorough assessment of that individual. The assessment will reveal to us, what is your goal? So is it traditional yoga practice in that you're trying to transcend your mind? It's a meditative very much experience. The physicality of it is to just take the tension out of your body and get to that meditative state. So I appreciate all of that. I get it. My daughter's a breath coach and very much into the yogic world. That doesn't suit my personality or my body, but nonetheless, I appreciate that. But the assessment tells me what is the goal of the individual. I need to know that. Then the next part of the assessment measures what they have in their body in terms of specific abilities and where they are on that physical spectrum, as I described, and what is their injury history. Well, I'm the spine guy, so I only see this from a spine injury perspective. So now I have to say, well, here's what you have. Here's your exposure history. Now we know why you have this specific damage or injury to your spine. Here's my opinion now to get to your goal that you defined. And we're going to use exercise or exposure as the way to get there. We're going to train the difference. So now I can answer the question, is yoga good for you to continue? Or is it now a poison? Before it helped you, but now it's a poison, and we're not going to bend the spine because that is causing your posterior disc bulge. We will focus on movement at the hips, knees, shoulders, and we're going to build spine control more in a neutral range. We will stop the disc bulges, allow it to gristle over time. So again, this is what Bernie does in the yoga world. If you read your yoga, your spine, he will take you through the assessment. Well, I know where the assessment came from. That's what we did together. It helps the yoga practitioner define what is good for them within the context of really what is their goal. And the conflict in their mind could be they just passionately believe that yoga is going to take them to this lifelong path of health, which it may, or it may not. Maybe the thing that they crossed the tipping point.
Specifically with yoga, I think there is that kind of, I hesitate to say kind of magical thinking around, well, yoga will fix it because it's it's this traditional spiritual practice that if I keep doing it, it will somehow fix everything that's going on. I'll pass through the pain. I mean, that's very common to hear this kind of approach. Yep.
There are yoga practitioners and there are teachers, and whether you want to call them yogis or yoginis or yoga masters, I mean, people who are revered in the world. They've come to me. I'm never going to reveal who they are, but they've come to me as a spine patient. And I have to tell them, I know what the cause of your pain is. I remember one famous person coming, and they sat down on the floor. They brought one, I think it was one ankle behind their head, and another one crossed over. And then they had someone put a sandbag on that knee to start pulling it down. And then I said, okay, could you stand up, please? And it took them about 10 minutes to slowly, carefully unwind their body because of the pain and then stand up with assistance. And I said, I know what's causing your pain. And they were devastated that it was the yoga practice. And yet, anyone.
I laugh because it obviously seems so obvious when you're sitting there thinking, no shit. Like, look at what you're doing.
Right. But my point is, you get this, Adam. This was their life. This was their livelihood. They've been teaching people. This was their lifelong work and commitment. So how psychologically devastating is that to say, well, keep doing it and you will stay the way you are. But here is a path that I'm suggesting you do, and calm down on the exposure that we just proved is your not only pain mechanism, but it is becoming so bad now that you're impinging the nerves. You've got arthritic spurs on the facet joints. I mean, this is not going to end well for you. So anyway, we get it.
To give,
It's
I suppose,
finding the middle of the road. Before we came on, we were talking about our heritage and our common Irish. But, I credit my father, who had a good amount of Irish blood in him. He just says, moderation in all things, but a little bit of what tickles your fancy is good for you.
yeah, I've
And
heard that from my own family. Well, apart from Guinness, really, and that
yeah,
doesn't seem
but,
that doesn't come under that caveat.
but anyway, that's not a bad thought.
What about this idea, but Stu, of spinal stiffness, right? I mean, because that's particularly one of your things, and I think that would give more context for people in terms of the way that you approach things. And it's kind of it's a bit of an anathema for a yoga practitioner who is always looking to bend the spine. And even we hear in yoga, you're only as old as your spine, as if you want to bend that as much as possible, and it will keep you young. I mean, but your book suggests the opposite, that you actually need to use the trunk muscles to keep the spine stiff and bend from the hips or from the shoulder girdle, I think.
Thank you for allowing me to explain this. So it may take me a few minutes, but if you
That's
bear
all right.
with me,
That's all right.
I will
Yeah.
address this word stiffness, because I get it. Stiffness is a bad word to many people who are trying to free their body of stiffness. So every material has properties. A piece of steel, a tendon, your spine, it has mass, it has strength, it has toughness, it has viscosity, it has stiffness. Stiffness is the relationship between applied load and deformation. So there's an elastic band that we might train with. I'm going to apply a load to it, and it deformed a certain distance. If it's not very stiff, it deforms a long way for the same amount of pull. If it's very stiff, it hardly pulls at all. So stiffness is only a material property that defines the relationship between applied load and deformation. That's it. So that's where we start. It's neither bad nor good. It is a material property. Okay, now let's take a model spine. And by the way, these are all made by Dynamic Disc Designs. These are the most biofidelic models of the spine and the body. This joint, L3, this disc is normal. L4 has been damaged a little bit. L5 is normal. When you damage a joint, you change the stiffness. So imagine a knee joint. A knee joint rotates through the range of motion, and if it's normal, the center of rotation is in the joint. But if you damage the ligament, the joint rotates, but then it clunks in shear. That has lost stiffness. That's all it means. So now let's look at a spine where this joint has been damaged. Now I'm going to apply a general torque. So I might be doing one knee over the opposite knee as an asana. And do you see the joint that has lost normal stiffness? Do you see all the micro movements that are taking place at that joint, but not at the normal joint above and the normal joint below? Now look at the work that's being done on the facet joints of the joint that's lost stiffness. Now, do you see them working? They're painted red, they're hot, they're angry. So if you keep bending it at that injury site, you will lose more stiffness and get more pain. But here's the nasty trick. Stretch reflex. When you stretch a muscle, you will get a temporary feeling of analgesia, a jolly. Now, if you talk to the average yoga person, they are on the spectrum for getting a supreme jolly out of it. But not me. I call that jujitsu. So I would much rather go to jujitsu class, which is a form of end range of motion. The object is to place an opponent at an extreme range of motion and get the angle perfect and apply 1 ounce of load, and then they submit. That is gorgeous jujitsu. It's a matter of a millimeter here, a half a degree there, and apply the load. So this is the science of jujitsu. Now, when I go to some yoga studios, I don't see yoga. I see them doing jujitsu to their clients. They are so imprecise and so unaware of what they're doing to some people's joints. So again, I go right back to Bernie, my friend, who recognizes this and places the joints. Yes, you can go to extreme range of motion. And there are times when the compression of a joint and some of these things, it's anabolic, it's building, it's not crossing the tipping point. You change it 1 millimeter or 1 degree, it just turned into jujitsu. Now you're damaging the hips, damaging the spine, etc. So let's get back to stiffness. Stiffness is lost in injury. When a person bends the spine generally, they can't control where the loss of stiffness is. It goes right to the site of damage and it causes even more damage. So would I say go to extreme range of motion in your spine? No. I would say read Bernie's book and now think regionally in your body for better health. Let's make a stable spine. You restore stiffness by keeping the spine in a neutral position, but you add stiffness to the joint with an abdominal brace, making control. So when you start to fold forward, more of the folding takes place at the hips. Be conscious of your back. When you pick up your grandchild, stiffen your spine, engineer out the loss of stiffness that I just told you because of the legacy of injury. Pick up your child, pull them through with their hip joint, and enjoy. Lower the same way, because here's a very common yogic neurology. They're fine picking things up. We'll teach them I'll put my hands on my knees and I'll pull my hips through, establishing a hip hinge. But for them to lower their grandchild, their strategy is to relax and they lose control. And they get hurt, not when they pick up the child. They get hurt when they place the child down or put the child down in a crib because their neurology was to relax, to do eccentric contraction. So again, in Bernie's yoga practice, it's control to concentrically contract, eccentrically contract. Don't expose the damaged joint to more stress because its tipping point is now lowered. So does this start to address this issue of stiffness, the spectrum of stability and mobility, and how you carefully engineer these to avoid the pain mechanism and now transform the yoga practice far beyond, how far can you bend? Can you do the wheel pose and all of that stuff? That doesn't matter anymore. What matters is scientific strategy and technique so that you're creating mobility optimally where your body is designed to create it and suits your injury history and your current level of fitness and all the rest of it, but takes the stress off the damaged item that has lost constituent stiffness, the material property of that. So it's not a bad thing. It's only just defining it, just like mass and everything else. So does that help?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that it brings to mind another quote that you mentioned: "All systems require stress for optimal health." And again, kind of begging the question, though, like, what is this stress? I mean, you mentioned not doing the wheel. Many people are very attached to doing what we call the Dhanurasana, the wheel. I assume, though, that you could only ever bend in the lower back a lot there. So like your credit card earlier, if people are doing that on a daily basis and they're going to be bending in the L4 or 5 region every day, that's going to inevitably weaken, unstiffen that particular disc. I think.
No, it won't.
No, it won't. Right.
No. This is very important, Adam. Let me define this. Let's go back to that concept of power, force times velocity. If the person only does yoga and they never put heavy load on their back, they will adapt a softer collagen, shall we say. So it allows more mobility. The problem with softer collagen comes when you expose it to high load. So this might be a person who goes to yoga class and then goes to train at the gym, and they get a gym trainer who says, oh, you're not a real woman until you can deadlift your body weight. Well, it's even so extreme now on the internet that you're not a real woman until you can deadlift twice your body weight. What the hell? And now they've preconditioned their spine for mobility, conditioned the collagen to be soft and pliable, and then pressurize it so that the gel is seeking the softness as the collagen delaminates. So it's not a matter of one or the other, shall we say. I'm saying if you're going to extremes and you want extreme mobility and yoga practice, again, avoid the heavy stress to the joints. It's interesting when you look at really resilient athletes. Some people say, "Oh, well, you stretch and reduce the risk of injury." That hasn't worked out real well. The athletes, the ones who can dunk a basketball flying off the top of the key and whatnot, do you think they have nice, limber, loose hamstrings and what? No, they're springs. They're very tight. They're tuned springs, so they short range stiffness, bounce off and fly through the air and whatnot. This is what I really appreciated in the last half of my career as I became much more known as for specializing in elite athletes. And when you measure, as I have, the best in the world in all of these different sports, they're not the strongest. They're not the most mobile. They're not the most whatever. They are tuned elastically, and they have a balance of all of these constituents
for their particular things, aren't they? They're tuned for their particular discipline.
Yeah, they are a one horse pony, shall we say? So, or they have unidimensional athleticism, is what I say. So, do you think a swimmer is going to be the best runner? And you see this in triathlons, for example. There are those who've been touched by the hand of God. The rare exceptions who get out of the lake first and they get on their bikes and then they can still run. But generally speaking, a swimmer is very loose in their joints because they have to be a fish. But that isn't the best neurology or stiffness in their ankles to bounce off the ground and be a good runner. Do you see what I mean a little bit?
Is it okay to be like a one-trick pony, or should we try and broaden out to be kind of every man of all disciplines a little bit? Is it imbalanced? People are saying, well, you're just doing yoga, so your flexibility is way imbalanced, and you should balance that up a bit more so you can, enjoy a multitude of activities then to try and gain more kind of balance in your body.
Well, that was the point of our assessment that starts with a very long discussion. So when I was a young professor, the patient would come in and I'd say, well, let me examine you. And I'd do my orthopedic and neurological exams and whatnot. And then I learned when we first started seeing people, I set aside 2 hours to see clients. And my medical colleagues would say, 2 hours, what are you going to do with a spine patient for 2 hours? And I said, well, I'm going to talk and listen to them. And then, after a year at them, I turned that into 3 hours. So that first interview, it might be 10 minutes or it might be 45 minutes, but the point is they're telling me what they want to do in life. So the more mobility you have, if that's your thing, fine. But you've compromised your ability to bear a load. So to answer your question, most people want to do everything. God won't let you have everything to the max. Everything is a trade-off. If you have a high VO2 max, say you're a marathon runner, that neurology that you adapt is completely counter to an explosive neurology, right? So if you want a really explosive neurology, back off on your VO2 max and develop more fast twitch, fatigable fibers. Do you see what I mean? Everything is a trade-off. So this mobility, stability spectrum, VO2 max.
You can kind of recommend then someone going to the gym for.
Right. So now I'll use some of the science that we did with populations like police officers, firefighters, military groups, and different sports groups. We did volleyball, basketball, etc. The ones who were the most resilient, let's take elite police officers. So in Toronto, we studied the ETF, which is the SWAT team, the elite police officers who have to rappel buildings and all that kind of stuff. There were 70 men. We followed them for 5 years. As it turns out, resilience is a U-shaped function. In other words, the really unfit ones, and there weren't any really unfit ones on that team. But anyway, the more unfit and the most fit got hurt the most. The ones who had not maximum strength, not maximum mobility, but sufficient mobility, sufficient strength were the most resilient. But the ones who were going for maximum strength all the times were the most hurt. The ones who couldn't move because they were on the lower end would get higher incidence as well. So does that help you that you can't have it all? So our assessment really helps the person lock on to what your goal is. Someone will say, oh, I really want my next personal best in deadlift, and they're there, they can't even tie their own shoes because of their back pain. And I'll say, really? Who's paying you $1 million to set your own personal deadlift record in your mother's basement? And they'll say, yeah, I never quite thought of it that way. I said, how about this? Do you have kids? And they'll say, yeah, I got kids. I said, how about this for a goal? Would you like to be the best granddad on this planet when you're 75 or 80 years old? And they'll say, yeah, I like the sounds of that. And I said, good, because you're not going to make it. Be moderate. And you have a much better chance of being that rocking granddad, getting down on the floor. But, I get professional athletes who they're 50 years old. They can't get off the floor anymore. They were too extreme. Anyway, is this answering the question a little bit on defining what it is the person wants and really defining it, because some of them don't know, and then giving them a pathway to get there that is biologically attainable and sustainable?
So what about people who've got back pain? They don't know what it is. Can you say anything about diagnosing common conditions? I mean, obviously someone should come to you, but other than that, in the book, in Spine Mechanic, Back Mechanic, you talk about disc bulge, the one that we can't pronounce, or you can pronounce, beginning with an S, spondy something.
Spondylolisthesis.
Yeah. Everyone talks about, and any back pain, everyone immediately says, I've got sciatica. That's kind of like a catch-all for kind of almost anything. But as I understand it, involves nerve pain down the leg, stenosis, which my mother had, the thinning of the nerves in the spine. So I know a little bit about that, and scoliosis. Often people talk about scoliosis. I mean, is there anything you can say about any of these conditions, or
yeah, there's a lot. Every one of them is different, and the path forward for an individual will be different. Even people with stenosis, one will be different from the other. So if they can get a thorough assessment, and I'll this is where I arrived at my career. So it's not self-serving, but it sort of is, I guess. I had to train clinicians to thoroughly assess all of these subcategories of back pain. Back pain's only a symptom. The diagnosis, there's 100 different diagnoses that lead to the symptom of back pain. So, if I said to you, oh, I've got nonspecific leg pain, can you give me a yoga exercise for my nonspecific leg pain? Well, no, you couldn't. But if they told you I have a broken femur or I have a torn ACL ligament, do you see what I mean? You would then know what to do. So we trained clinicians who were very skilled in these thorough assessments of back pain to make it very specific. And then that informs what the best path forward is. Not everybody can get to one of those clinicians. So I wrote the book Back Mechanic, and you've seen it. Chapter 6 guides the person through a self-assessment of their pain. Well, believe it or not, that assessment will inform them more about their specific pain than the typical visit to a clinician.
Absolutely.
And then based on that, which one might be simply this: sit upright in a chair, and do you have back pain? And let's assume they say no. And then you say, fine, don't move your head and neck, but just slouch down like this. Did that cause your pain? And the person might say, well, yeah, that created my familiar back pain. Good. Bending forward, we just showed you, creates your familiar back pain. But if you bend forward at the hips, you don't have pain. Ah, okay. No one's ever shown me that before. Now, let's go back. That's creating my back pain. Now bring your chin to your chest. Oh, my right toe just went numb. That's sciatica. So now they learned that nerve tension, because I'm pulling the nerve at one end, is simply a rope. So now they know with precision what's causing their foot to go numb and their back pain, just as an example. And we'll take them through extension and holding a weight in front of them and all of these different tests. Once they've learned that, they then know, okay, if I bend over now with, I put my hands down to my knees and I tune my back. I don't fully flex it. I don't fully extend it. I just keep my spine neutral and I bend down and pull with my hips. I've eliminated my pain. So that might be an example of them learning through the self-assessment what the trigger is, and now we can give them a solution, a movement hack. The next person might say, when I slouch down, that takes my pain away. Okay, that's the pattern of central stenosis. There's lateral stenosis, central stenosis. So that might be a good thing, because they'll say, when I stand and go for a walk, that causes my pain. Sitting down takes my pain away. That's more of an older person's report. They will say, but 30 years ago, sitting caused my pain and walking was my relief. But they didn't know that. But anyway, we point all these things out to people, and then we create mobility hacks, which inform them on what's good practice. And we give them, we just proved that you need some stability to your spine, a little bit more control. We're going to engineer out that micro movement that's causing, when you lay in bed, you get an ache in your back. Good. Put a folded towel under your waist. Oh, that took my ache away. Good. Push your right heel away. Oh, that took the pain out of my leg for the first night I slept. So do you see how individual all of this is? Even despite the subdiagnosis of having stenosis or whatever it is. And the person will self-discover their strategies. Now, here's the funny thing. I'm going to talk about the tipping point. And imagine if you stubbed your toe today. Tomorrow, you're going to stub the toe again. It hurts a little bit more. On the third day, you still stub your toe. It is so angry now that all you have to do is lightly touch your toe and you scream. Stop stubbing your toe. Don't do yoga. Don't do anything. Just stop stubbing your toe. And the tipping point that triggered the pain now just goes up. So you've desensitized just by taking the trigger away. Now we're going to retune your body to become more robust against stubbing your toe. So this is the 3-step, 4-step way.
So in a sense, avoiding the pain triggers is a main thing. Like learning what triggers your pain, avoiding the triggers, let the body come back to neutral, as it were, so it's not triggered by any little pain, and then create. I mean, one thing I need to get to here, so in my mind, what about posture, right posture? When people are taught posture, as you well know, they're taught to stand up straight, which ends up kind of creating often a bit of a hinge in the middle of the back, I think. And I think you mentioned that in the book. And I'm sure posture is one of the spinal health aspects of diagnosis. Have you anything to say about that?
Yeah, I can riff on that for hours. I had a jiu-jitsu patient yesterday, and they were like that demeanor, and they were gripping with their gluteal muscles and ramming their knees back hard and creating an extension ache in their low back. And I said, okay, well, where's your pain? Oh, it's right here, right here. And I say, good, soften your knees, jazz knees a little bit. And they said, oh, watch, I'm going to soften my knees. Did you see how I came out of that hard extension?
Yeah.
I said, oh, that's magical. The back pain just went away. Now you're going to love this, Adam. I then did a little bit of a yogic drill on them. I had them kneel on the floor, put their elbows on a chair, and then let their elbows come forward, and then add a 1 pound push down through their elbows into the seat pan of the chair. And I said, just let your chest breathe out the tension, let it fall. And they tended, remember, before they did that, they were a bit kyphotic and forward, coupled. So they were too flexed in the upper half of the body, too extended in the lower half, jazz knees, unlock the grip. And now when they stood up for free, they found all that stress-free mobility by removing the stiffness. I gave them stiffness in their lower back. I took some away in their upper back, and he stood up and he said, this is fantastic. I don't have any pain. So there was, just a little bit of an awareness, an experience to see where the body wasn't tuned. Anyway, does that bring
yeah, absolutely. What about if you've got an excessive lumbar curve, or like me, I'm slightly kyphotic. I've always been told I'm kyphotic. Is there anything? Are we meant to be having the curves then?
By who? Who assessed you and determined what was so pain-causing and crippling of this kyphotic?
No, it's never caused me pain. That's the thing. Never caused me pain.
There you go.
Yeah. And it's just been a slightly, upsetting to hear that someone say, well, your back's wrong. And many people have had this about the posture, right? From growing up to being told that they're not in good posture, et cetera, et cetera. But we're meant to have the curves, right? And we're not trying to flatten the curves. You often talk about a lordotic curve being a good thing. And to that end, I'd like you briefly to talk about the hips and the hinge from the hip.
Just let's go back to that lordosis. It's again, remember, genetics loads the gun. If you follow lordosis around the world, there are some gene pools. Like if you take a typical Korean spine, very little lordosis. Now, if you go to other populations in the world, they have a lot of lordosis. They lay on their back, and you can see daylight under their low back with their buttocks and their hips. So both of those populations have stresses from doing different things. So, the lordotic spine, we will put a lumbar pad under their back when they're sleeping on their back to take the ache away. I couldn't do that to a flat back spine. Now, is one better than the other? No, but it's defined by pain. So if if a person comes in with pain, I don't have an opinion. You have enjoy your little kyphosis there, Adam. That's fine. You don't have pain. But it's the assessment of the pained individual that informs everything. Then I have an opinion, a strong opinion. But no, I don't see anything wrong with you if you don't have pain. So how's that?
Perfect. Quite happy with that.
But this is the thing that, gets out on the internet. Oh, McGill's this, McGill's that. And they don't get the context right. McGill, he just stiffens people's backs and whatnot. No, wait a second. We measure the stiffness and whether it's involved in pain or performance. If you want to throw a baseball 120 miles an hour, you better be an elastic tuned spring. You want to hit a golf ball 400 yards, same thing. If you want to throw a punch as a combat athlete, or, it's there's a lot of expertise there. So it's just so crude to hear someone say, oh, McGill does something with stiffness, and they have no idea.
Well, everyone gets misinterpreted, I think, and especially if you've got such a wide breadth of audience as you now have. And just getting to the end of the interview, what about the hips then? Because you do talk, and Bernie's picked this up, I think, when you're working with you, about the hip hinge. And people will say that, you should or shouldn't bend from your lower back, doing a forward fold, for example. And I think you're quite particular on this, and you've been interpreted, I think, out of context on this as well, I believe.
For sure. Yeah. Well, let's just go back to that genetics loads the gun, and then we'll talk about individuals. Bernie, in your yoga, your spine, or vice versa, your spine, your yoga. Um, uh, when you measure the depth of the hip socket, so there's the ball of the femur inside the hip socket. Let's just go through Caucasian Europe. The highest rate of hip dysplasia is in Poland. In fact, it's one of the highest rates in the world.
Really?
Because as a genetic population, on average, they have the shallowest hip socket. So the hip tends to come out. You know, the babies wear special diapers, and that not everyone, of course, but this is more common. So the orthopedic disease is linked to the anatomy of the hip socket. Now, where do the Olympic weightlifters come from? Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Western Russia, down into the Dalmatian coast, etc. Point being, to do a deep squat, heavily loaded, the power production in a dysplastic hip is fantastic getting out of the hole. You've got the weight overhead, and now you're going to drive up. Now, let's go to Western Europe. It's the highest rate of FAI, femoral acetabular impingement, because it's the deep hip socket. So very deep. So when you flex the hip, the femur and the neck bang into the front of the rim of the hip. The labrum is sore. The capsule is sore. Anyway, but standing strength and standing stability is ungodly. Fabulous hip. So if you take a Celtic hip, as I call it, and you measure it, the deadlift power, it's a struggle. They fail pulling the bar off the ground because the hips are impinged. But as soon as the bar passes the knee, that deep hip socket, they don't fail in lockout. Who fails in lockout tends to be more of the dysplastic hip, the shallow hip socket that had great power in the beginning of the. So there's just a little bit of a thought on hip anatomy from a strength and performance point of view, a little bit of mobility there. But now, if I was to put it in a yoga context, what I've always advocated for, and Bernie too, is let's look at the person's anatomy, put them on all fours, and now have your knees fairly narrow together and your feet. Rock your pelvis back to your buttocks. How far can you go? Where's the pain? Is it in your knee? Is it in the hip anteriorly being pinched? Because a shallow hip socket, the hips are free. Back they go. And then I might play with the neurology of moving the head back and forth, and then I'll get the patient back to all fours again. Let's spread out the knees and the feet. Rock back. That hip joint will determine how far they can go back without stress. And now we're going to reshape the hips. It's called the frog. We're going to keep the knees wide. We're going to pull the heels together. Now rock the buttocks back towards the heels. Oh, I'm free. Zero pain. Their hip capsules were tight. But was it genetics loading the gun? Was it exposure adapting their hips? It's all of these things. Or no, they've got some, they've pushed their hips a little bit too hard. And over time, they crossed the tipping point. They damaged the labrum. They damaged the capsule. Now they've grown some bone spurs. And now it aches like a son of a gun. Now the cartilage starts to deteriorate. And you're looking at a guy who knows a bit about this because I'm hip replaced.
Yeah, I'm kind of on that spectrum as well, I have to say. Yeah.
So, thank you for my Celtic hips. Thank you for my bravado as a younger fella, squatting deep and heavy. Look at my colleagues. I won't name them now, but if you know them in the strength world, how many of them are hip replaced? And they will tell you, yeah, it was deep loaded heavy squats did my hips in. Now, I wasn't in the yoga world when I was younger, but I sure get patients now where
Yeah.
here's a woman from London uh, who's now 55 years of age and her hips need replacing. A, genetics loaded the gun. B, pushing her hips as she didn't suit her anatomy. So the exposure didn't suit her anatomy. Had she had shallower hip sockets, this probably wouldn't have happened. But anyway, I've seen enough people coming in through the door and measuring their hips, and the benefit is I've been able to watch them now over 45 years, and you start to recognize the patterns. So that, I hope, puts it in a yoga context, but it goes right back to that tipping point: moderation in all things.
I think that's probably a good place to end it. Moderation, yeah, and yeah, read the book, guys. I mean, because there's a lot of, I feel there's a lot of grey context around this. Like what you're saying is like there's not one solution, even from the same back problem. There's many solutions to different people, and it's I mean it's complicated, and your assessments that you give in the book are detailed. And I didn't cover today, but I also wanted to cover the idea of pain and the perception of pain, which is the milieu, which is deeper than just simply the actual pain, but also the context around it. I mean, I know you've done a little bit of work with other things, emotional pain and life circumstances as well. So yeah, there's a lot to it. I think for my last just outro for you, I'm always intrigued when you talk about riding your snowmobile. Um, and the fact that, well, first of all, it's such an exotic idea for us, like in the UK, to have a snowmobile. And the fact, in another podcast, I heard you rode it on a lake and you crashed, and so you've stopped riding now because you crashed at 100 miles an hour into a rock and broke your spine. Is that right?
Well, to show you how stupid men are,
Yeah.
two years ago, I've always enjoyed a hot sled. You know, some guys like motorcycles or whatever. So I've probably
So
had.
motorized like a skidoo, but you're on ice, like that kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, no, I have a skidoo. Yeah,
Yeah.
and some of them approach 200 horsepower. I've probably owned 70 of them over my life of different flavors and sorts. So 2 years ago, I was doing my last ride of the year across a lake, and I wanted to hit 100 miles an hour. I saw 98 on the clock. I was looking at it. It was getting dark. I hit a damn rock. I shot up in the air. I fractured my T9. The guy behind me said, "Oh, I knew you were in trouble. I saw your tail light go way up in the air." Anyway, so 2 weeks ago, I went out on the lake, and it was a perfect day. These are two-stroke engines, high compression. When it's cold, they crack horsepower. Really dense air, lots of oxygen, and the ice was stiff. I'll use that word again. Very little snow on it. I was getting good grip. I was getting high horsepower. So I'm going to see if I can do it. Anyway, I hit
Okay.
I hit 104 miles an hour, 167 kilometers an hour 2 weeks ago. But anyway, I was locked, I just full rigidity, locked in, getting pounded. And I just,
Talking
so
about
there's
moderation,
a
eh?
man for you. So I'm still doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a great contradiction of your philosophy of moderation, and there you go. But a wonderful chat, and I do recommend that guys get the book because you're also a great character, and as well as very very comprehensive in your field. So thank you for joining us today, and it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Okay, Adam. Well, thanks for all you do, and good luck to you.
Cheers.
Bye bye.